Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Season 8, Episode 7 of Music is Not a Genre, MxG. Topic for this week, The Great Producers, Part 2, Multitracking in the 1960s. But before we get to that, as always, thank you for watching and listening. Listeners, go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre. You get a video for every episode of this podcast. Don't forget to subscribe. Watchers, go to nickdimatteo.com/musicisnotagenre. If you would rather just listen and not ask me why I'm wearing this period-specific-ish shirt for this particular episode. And everyone, go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre, patreon.com/musicisnotagenre. Everyone, go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre, all one word. Why? Because that helps support this podcast, my band rec, and everything I do. Indie creators like me need supporters like you. We don't get what we should be getting from streaming and things like that, if you know anything about the streaming world and the paltry revenue and stuff. So we need supporters to help keep this thing going. Patreon.com/musicisnotagenre is where you can do that. And as always, like and share and subscribe, rate and review, and lather and rinse repeat, and all the things that everyone tells you to do. It really works. And you've been doing it a little more often lately, and I've seen the difference. So thank you very much. But please, if you haven't liked, shared, subscribed, rated, reviewed, whatever, do that. It helps us beat the algorithm, if that's even possible. Please don't forget, I have a business called The Song Coach. If you're someone who has struggled to write a song or has put it off for whatever reason, I can help you not just write that song, but learn how to write any song you want ever and forever, whether it's with me or on your own. Go to nickdimatteo.com/thesongcoach to find out more information and book a free 30-minute call. Either just, again, just a call or a Zoom, which I prefer because I like to see your face. And my band rec, the new single, the last single from our epic album, Kite to Camden, is Me Happy. It's a trippy kind of shoegazy thing, which is one of my favorites. I didn't expect it to be, but it is. And apparently it's one of your favorites too, because it's really risen up to number 2 on Spotify, at least for rec. And you can find out all about that and listen to it if you go to nickdimatteo.com/music. It's got links to socials and discography and my live page and credits and all of that stuff. Anything you need to know and anywhere you need to go is at nickdimatteo.com/music. Let's get to the topic again. It is The Great Producers, Part 2, Multitracking, and the 1960s. So this is, as it said, Part 2 in the series. Last week, we did Part 1, which was prehistory in the 1950s. I don't usually go from in a series right back to back, week to week, unless there's some compelling reason to, because I like to spread it out, as you may know from my album series and my Beatles series and all of that. But I am so excited to talk about producers that I just had to jump right into this week. And so the subtitle, Multitracking, as I always say, changes in tech and changes in music go hand in hand. They influence each other. There's a very close relationship between the two, and I'll talk more about that, a lot about that when we get into it. And in the case of the 1960s, the biggest tech development was the widespread use of multitracking, from 2 to 4 to 8 tracks, and eventually more. And I'll go into exactly what that is and how it changed music from that point and forever, and why certain modern ideas of what we think of as music and music recording really took shape in the 1960s. I'm going to say this again for people who missed Part 1. Music production is a huge passion for me. I've been doing it since I was a child. No lie. No cap. I don't know. And while I have some favorite music from before the 60s, which I talked about a little last weekend in other episodes, this is really the decade when things started to spark for me. And I always wondered why, and some of it has to do with age. There are people who don't care about the 60s, who do hear it as something old. But there was a qualitative difference between the 50s and 60s in a way that a lot of that music from the 60s carries forward to today that doesn't sound as dated as it does in the 50s. And I'll talk about that a little bit later and the reasons why. But I would attribute the spark in me to the clear evidence of multitracking's effects on music creation. And I'll tell you why later. Show format, I'll go over the tech and music changes that happened in the decade. Then I'll spotlight the producers, including some honorable mentions. And then conclusions. including my favorites from the decade, a featured song, which again is sort of a left field pick, questions, and don't forget, at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre, the bonus MxTRA this week is on the 5 producer archetypes. I've kind of vetted and also come up with the fact that there are only 5 producer archetypes, and they range from auteurs who control everything to those who kind of sit back and only pop into the process when they think something is needed. And I go through all 5 of those archetypes, and I chose it this week for the bonus MxTRA because this is the decade, the 60s, when finally all of those existed. Some existed before, but all the producer archetypes that exist now existed by the 1960s. So that's patreon.com/musicisnotagenre for that bonus episode. Sources: Wikipedia, Google, musicradar.com, spectropop.com, blacksunshinemedia.com. Oh, disclaimers. As always, while my producer choices are not arbitrary, I try to stick to the big guns and some, outliers. They are incomplete, and they're probably biased to a degree. I will go into some of the tech to illustrate how it affected the music. And in fact, in this episode, I will go into more of the tech than I have certainly last week, and maybe more than I will in some of the future episodes, at least because of the massive tech changes that affected all of the rest of music in this decade. But not so detailed to make this a tech episode. This is not a tech episode. None of these will be. But I try to explain enough of it so that you kind of get a flavor of why I'm saying such and such was such an important development, and all of that. With all of this tech talk, both of us, you and I, hello out there, will be tempted to project forward and compare the 60s to today, analog to digital. I'm not going to do that in this episode much, if at all, probably very, very, very little, because it doesn't apply to the 1960s. I'm going to save it for a future episode of this series. I will be talking about some people who were assholes, who were not great people. Happened last week. It's going to happen probably every week. And as I mentioned, I like to focus on the music. Their contributions to music were still quite significant. And that doesn't mean I condone them as people or anything they did. But I do believe that often creations outpace, outperform, outgrow their creators. It just happens. It's why we can like certain things made by people who were not great people. And that goes not just to music. It goes to all arts and technology in general. Speaking of, let's get to that section. Tech and music changes. In the 1960s, as I said, tech and music have always gone hand in hand. For the few thousand years before electronics and recorded music, tech changes dealt with the creation and improvement of instruments. So you built a string instrument. Sounded fine. You wanted to find ways to make it sound better. You invented tuning. You used different string material, different wood, what have you. And then created a different instrument, one that had keys or whatever it was. And that was the first few thousand years. And finding more and better ways to project live sound was the other tech consideration in all those years, such as megaphone type things, anything that helped project, the sound further than what you were saying, changing the shape and materials of a venue. So you had an amphitheater, let's say Roman, Greek. How do you get those plays to project the back row? It's how you shape the theater and the materials you made it of, et cetera, et cetera. Even learning more about the human body to further enhance vocal production, which is kind of what opera was. After recorded music began, as I said last week, it was all about finding better ways to do 2 things. Capture the sound. So microphones started, got better. Used to be the megaphone, then it was a microphone, et cetera. Mega, big, micro, small. There's the relation there. Phone, sound. Recording equipment, improvements there. Creating it, improving it, adding to it. The room itself. When they realized, you change the size and shape and the materials in the room, that makes a difference in how something is recorded. And the second consideration since then is how to disseminate that sound. Was it on cylinders that people could purchase or listen to, discs, vinyl, and everything that came after? That continued through the late 1940s into the 1950s when recording technology shifted to tape. At that point, people started to consider more than just the quality of the recording. And I think it's important to say here how significant that shift to tape was. It has made possible and spurred on and inspired everything else that's come after it. If we were still recording in the old way, straight to disc, or whatever other material it was, we would not be able to do any of what we did. Or, I mean, someone might have come up with something, but tape accelerated that process. And that's because you could make decisions about how to manipulate it to make it distinct from just capturing live music. It gave you more flexibility in how you were recording, and we'll get into a little bit of that later. And as I said last week, this is how and why the role of producer formed from its various antecedents. And I talked about the roles that existed before producers ever existed and how they morphed into the role of producer. And a lot of that happened because the technology changed and made it possible and made it necessary that somebody stepped up and do that. That tape shift happened gradually from about 1943 on. And I've talked about the history of recorded music in other episodes, so I don't need to go into detail on that here, and you can also look it up, but go check my old episodes out. At which point, many systems from the 40s on were using 2 tracks. But in the late 1940s, Les Paul experimented with what he called sound-on-sound recording, which is basically overdubbing, recording something, stopping, going back to the beginning, recording something over top of that, etc. So you're layering. And at that point, the standard was 3 tracks. And I love this, all right? Here's why it was ideal at the time, but I'm going to say something after that that might blow your mind. It was ideal to have 3 tracks at the time. They could have chosen another number, but they would think this is what we need. It's all we really need, because you could then record the backing tracks, split them to the sides, and record the lead vocal or lead instrument, if it was an instrumental, straight up the middle on the 3rd track. Now, what might blow your mind is that that's how we do it today. And you might say, wait a second. First of all, you said you weren't going to talk about today, but this is, I think, fun to talk about. And you might also say, but we can do hundreds of tracks now if we really wanted to. But think of the end effect. And that end effect is whatever the main thing in the song is right up the middle almost all the time, unless people are experimenting with various ideas, which is great, but it's uncommon, less common. And that could be the vocal or the lead guitar or a lead instrument of some sort. Bam, up the middle, everything else split to the sides. So we could have 60 tracks on a song, still the same effect as when they had 3 tracks. I mean, it blew my mind. It's just something to pop into my head. By the late 1950s, multitracking was being used almost everywhere. And while 8-track recording was possible as early as 1955, most studios and individuals were using 2- and 4-track recorders because they were far more affordable. So there were a few that used, there were a few that used 8-track by then, but not many. And we'll get into that a little later. Maybe now, which brings us to the decade in question, the 1960s, when 4-track systems were the standard. That became the standard for quite a number of years. So many were still using 2 tracks because, again, that they were comfortable with them. They couldn't afford a 4-track maybe. And a few studios with deeper pockets were using 8 tracks as early as the mid-late 1950s. That would spread a lot more by the late 60s and beyond. But really at this point, 4 tracks, a lot of the Beatles material done on 4 tracks. We'll get more into where things went after this in future episodes of the series, but for now, let's stop here and talk about how this changed music recording and production, all this developments in technology. Number 1, you no longer had to record everything all at once. You could do the backing tracks first and then the vocals, for example. This meant that it was now possible to focus more intently on getting the best takes of everything. So do the backing tracks as many times as you could afford, and then you didn't have to worry about the vocalist also being on point. Or you could do part of the backing tracks and then add a guitar into that. Same thing. Give the performers multiple opportunities to get the best take, and opportunity to get the best recording of that take, as opposed to hoping that one of the run-throughs of everything all at once would be good enough on all fronts. Didn't have to do that anymore, unless you wanted to. People still do that today just to capture that live sound. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Number 2, because this was all being done on tape and had been for years at this point, you could splice in and out whatever sections you wanted. So if the backing track from verse 1 take 4, say, was better than the one on take 5, but you like the rest of take 5, you could just combine the two. Or you could take a section you loved and repeat it if you wanted a longer ending or a longer intro or double a chorus or whatever it is. Let me just quickly explain. This is one of the tech portions of this. What is splicing? So when I started recording, I'm old enough to have experienced the fact that the standard was still tape. That is not the case anymore. You're going to find a lot of studios who still love it because of the old school feel of it, but it's not not the standard anymore, and it hasn't been for a long time. I did do a fully digital recording super early on, earlier than probably almost maybe anybody and most people I know did. But for about the first 15 years of my recorded experience, whether it was at home or in a studio, it was on tape. And so what that meant was you had maybe 1-inch reels or 2-inch reels. And if you think of a cassette, it has 2 reels, spools of that magnetic tape. It's the same principle, really, but it's just thicker. And the thickness gives you an opportunity to better quality if you wanted more tracks, etc. It's compression, all of that. And I think the tapes I have, the reels, are 1-inch because it was an indie studio, and that was what they could afford and what I could afford. Still great quality. And so I got to watch engineers take their razor, and if I said, I really like this part of this song better, etc., splice out, cut out that part of the tape, and then tape it into the other take. Let's say you physically did that. We cut and paste now, or copy and paste in the computer, in the DAW, digital audio workstation. Back then, you did it physically. That's what splicing is. And it was done incredibly well. I mean, it had to be, but it was. I even did some of that myself at home at times. Number 3, you could layer more than 4 tracks. Bouncing or overdubbing is what that's going to explain a little bit of that later. So if you wanted to beef up backing vocals, maybe have, instead of 2 people harmonize, you wanted 8 people harmonizing, or guitars, maybe a second guitar with the same performer, or add additional percussion elements that couldn't be played by the drummer all at once, or special effects or other weirdness, you could now do all of it within reason. There were limits, but much more than prior. And keeping in mind, though, that every time you bounced your existing recorded tracks, the quality did degrade just a little bit. So what does that mean? When I got my first home studio, it was a 4-track cassette recorder. And I knew from the beginning that 4 tracks weren't going to do it for me. I needed 6 at minimum, 8 to 12 usually. And so I knew that the process was this. And it's very similar to the process in any of those studios back then, and to some, well, not today because you don't need to bounce, but back then especially, whereas you would record something like the drums first and maybe drums and bass. And so on my 4-track, I would record the drums on 2 tracks and the bass. And then I'd mix them, pan them, get them where I want it to be, level-wise, etc. Bounce them to the 4th track, which opened up 3 tracks. I would then take 2 of those tracks and do rhythm guitar, keyboards, let's say. Pan them, mix them, layer them, bounce them to the 4th track. Opened up 3 tracks again. And then I would record, let's say, the lead guitar and the backup vocals. And that would be, again, 3 tracks. Bounce that to the 4th track. So for those of you counting at home, that's right now, it's 3, 6, 8, right? And then I'd have 3 left over, and I might do 1 lead vocal, maybe some additional things on those. So there's the possible to have, and I could have done it more and more and more, but beyond that, again, that quality would degrade just a little bit. Not so much that most people could hear it, but enough that you had to be careful. But that enabled me and everyone who's done this to take that 4-track system and do maybe 8, 10, 12 tracks, as I mentioned. That's the bouncing process. Compare all this to the earlier process, both pre and post tape. So in pre-tape, you had 1 shot to get everything right all at once, unless you had the money to take more than 1 shot. If you wanted to just trash the, acetate or whatever it was you're recording on and use another one. But it costs money, it costs time. But really 1 or 2 shots. Every element had to be done dead on, all together well. Post tape, You could do more takes. Tape was cheaper. So, maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 takes, depending on the amount of money you had and time. With only 2 or 3 tracks, you did still usually do it all at once. Or you did the backing tracks first. You could do that several times and then allow the lead singer, let's say, to do their take a few times so you didn't have to worry about all of it happening together. So more tracks as we get into the 60s means more options to redo, and so the overall quality improved drastically. And though many 1960s recordings still sound dated compared to today, lots don't. And compared to the 1950s, when a much greater percentage sound dated, or the 1940s and before, when pretty much all of it sounds dated. And what I mean by dated is you compare that recording quality to today, and you've done this probably on streaming, and you notice a real difference. It's not as full. There's not as much bass. Maybe the volume isn't. It's maybe tinnier. It's scratchier. Whatever it is, that changed as the 60s came along. There are some recordings in the 60s that with little to no change sound like anything that could have been recorded today because technology had improved that much. And that doesn't even count things like how AI and other tech developments in the last 10 years have enabled people to go back and remaster things to the point where they do sound like they were recorded today, even though, they were recorded on, less technology from the time. Once you open Pandora's box, you're in for a mess of trouble. A lot of opportunities, a lot of options, and that's not always easy. I've had a lot of people who record music ask me how it is that I make decisions about things like keyboard sound or something like that, or what distortion to use on guitar. And it's instinct, because if you don't use instinct, I've got hundreds of options for keyboards in my recording suite. I'm not going to go through all those. You just have to kind of know when you hear it. But they had those options, and it's better to have the options than not, because it gives you an opportunity to experiment and expand your sound. Changes in music, that's what it was, which we'll get to shortly, compelled people to do more and more sound manipulation, adding outboard units aside from the mixing board for EQ, equalization, reverb, which is echo, distortion, like on a guitar, sometimes on a keyboard or vocal. And the more these proliferated, the more you needed a way to route and control them all. And this necessitated something called a patch bay, or at least patch bay made it much easier, more controllable, and gave you more options. Patch bays have been around since the first telephone switchboard. Look it up. In the 1870s, they weren't in widespread use, even in music recording, for another like 80, 90 years, till the 1960s. Finally, someone said, oh, well, the technology's caught up and there's a reason to use it now. Let's take that switchboard and modify it, make it a patch bay. And so what that means is you have, let's say, a reverb box, and you're singing into your input, your microphone on the mixing board. You could patch the reverb through that input so that when you sing, you're picking up that reverb. And you could use that reverb on other tracks as well at the same time, depending on how you use the patches. That's a patch bay. I never enjoyed messing with those. I let the engineer do it. I don't need to do it today at all. All of these changes are what enable producers, engineers, and musicians to often employ a phrase that you've probably heard a lot, which is fix it in the mix. That attitude is denigrated often today, but I think we take it for granted, because no matter what you say, unless you're such a purist that you're like, that's it, that's the take, I'm not changing it, we always do something after the fact. And that really started, it was possible earlier, but it really, really started in the 1960s. And that's a huge development, one that would have far-reaching consequences right away in that decade, and certainly through the rest of time. So let's say you're singing and you sang through to your input and you didn't have reverb on, and then you're like, oh, shoot, I wasn't sure, and now I think that reverb will be better for this track. You just put it on after the fact. You fix it in the mix. All right. Now that we've done an overview of the tech changes, let's get into what was happening with music itself. And this is not a series focusing on music development, nor is it a series on focusing on tech, but I give enough to give context. I'm not going to go through every thread. It's just an overview. I'm not going to go through every Fred either. I don't think I mentioned Fred again at all, whoever he is. where music was headed by the 1960s. So the 50s saw the official birth of rock and roll out of a handful of diverse genres and influences. That kind of amalgamation is what creates every new genre ever in history, from then till now and before. That said, those original genres also proliferated and morphed. They didn't stop existing. They created stuff I talked about last week, like how they separated country from folk. Race music became R&B, and then eventually soul separated from that, and all that separated from blues, further codifying what pop music was as something separate from all of that. But when we think of the 60s, we likely think mostly of either R&B and soul, like Motown and such, or rock, especially if you're a rockist. You think classic rock, 1960s, but there was so much more going on back then, as in every decade. As I mentioned in my album series, though, rock and roll was not the most popular genre in the 1960s. It's how we remember it now because the developments in output and effects were huge. Kind of like how I remember the 60s as huge for social and political developments, and they were, but the overall tenor of the times was a far cry from the changes that have happened since then. So we kind of overstate. Some of those changes were huge and significant, but we overstate some of them because we remember the parts that ended up affecting the rest of, humanity since then. And we're noting how important the growth was and the seed planting was during this period. So you still had things like pop, jazz, vocal music, like the Sinatras and Ellas and stuff. Musical theater was huge. Folk was very big. Country, instrumental, orchestral music was huge. Easy listening and all that. You had, along with rock and soul and R&B and eventually funk and a bunch of lighter pop genres. What marked the decade more than any of those separately was the willingness of producers and artists to mix them. When you listen to music from the 1940s and before, you might not pick up that there was some mixing of genres even then, because all of that eventually became the standard. We hear it as the standard, but when you compare 40s vocal jazz to 30s or 20s, you'll hear a difference. You'll hear them pulling from other sources, and that's what made that change. You can probably pick up more of that kind of mixing in the 1950s, but things were still pretty segregated. And I use that word on purpose because that's how the industry saw it, large portion of the public as well, and some musicians. At this point, it hadn't been that long since charts were divided along ethnic lines. Race music was for black people, which turned to R&B, and country music was for white people. And that's how the industry saw it. Yes, of course, this segregation continued into the 60s and to some extent through to today, but what you start to hear in the 60s is more willingness among musicians and the public to cross-pollinate, and in fact, a desire to pull in influences from all over, especially in the rock and pop worlds, but also in R&B and soul and orchestral and instrumental. You saw that influence, and eventually even musical theater, folk, and country. The public was hungrier for this kind of amalgamation, something that spread through the culture in so many ways. Beyond music, the hippie movement and wanting to know other cultures, whether it was Indian culture or cultures right here in America that originated here. Even though audiences were still quite divided, though, there was a lot more crossover. The industry picked up on this finally and amped up their cross-marketing even more than in the 1950s. All of this was both made possible and driven by the tech changes I discussed, as was the desire to mess around in the studio more. And that desire also spurred on the development of even more new tech and new ways of using old tech. So, for example, producer or an artist has an idea they want to flesh out and realizes in the process that it can only happen by modifying or upgrading the technology and or using new tech that opens up possibilities people couldn't even consider before them, which that compels both experimentation and inspiration. Artists start to think outside the box, as did producers, which is why the music landscape in 1965 was so different from 1960 and 55. While changes like this always happen, always have and always will, this is one of the few times in history when the change was rapid. While in many cases producers were called upon by the artists to create new sounds in new ways, and or those artists were themselves the producers, and we'll get into that later, it was more than anything the actual producers who pushed this forward in the 1960s. You could also say that tech and music changes inspired producers to experiment, which then inspired the artists to think experimentally, which created a new generation of artists taking the lead and asking producers to operate differently or doing it themselves, creating the exact kind of push-pull integrated dynamic that still exists in the healthiest recording environments today. And it really, really started in earnest in the 60s. All that said, without a capable and guiding producer at the helm, very little of this would have happened. So let's get to those producers, and we will do that right after the mid-roll break, and I'll see you in a minute. Hey, thanks for checking out this episode of Music is Not a Genre. If you'd like to learn more about this podcast, if you'd like to learn more about the music I do with my band Rec or any other projects or anything else about me, go to nickdematteo.com. That's Nick, DEMATTEO.com. And everything is there. There's even a link to a merch store where you can get t-shirts and mugs and hats and totes and notebooks and so many other things. I'm always adding new products there. Great way to support the podcast. And finally, go to patreon.com/music is not a genre if you really like to show your support. My fans and lovely family there get exclusives and other perks and early releases, and they get to suggest topics for future podcasts as well. Thanks for listening to the mid-roll. Now back to the show. All right, we are back. And by the way, I am looking for sponsors. So if there's something you want to promote, hit me up wherever you're listening or watching and let me know, because I am more than happy to add to or swap out that mid-roll for something that you want to promote. Just let me know. Let's get into producers of this decade, producers of the 1960s. So first note, as I said last week, I'm talking about those people who made their biggest impact in music development in this decade. So you might not hear some names you think deserve to be here. Rest assured, I will mention them eventually in other episodes. In the decade, they had more of an impact. And if I don't, then tell me, and I'll include them in my final summary episode of this series. And a lot of these producers I mentioned doesn't mean they stopped producing after this decade, and some of them started producing before this decade. This is when they made their greatest impact. Second note, there will again be people I talk about who are horrible. I told you that. I'm sure you can think of at least one 1960s producer who was pretty freaking horrible. But A, I won't go into that stuff because I'm keeping it about the music. If you want to hear about what the person did, go look it up. And B, it doesn't mean I condone their behavior. Like I said this earlier, and I said it in reference to J.K. Rowling because we recently saw Harry Potter and the Cursed Child on Broadway. Very good show, by the way. I said this to someone who asked about the show. Sometimes the creation outgrows and outshines its creator. That's true for that world of Harry Potter, and it's true for so much music and other things and buildings and organizations and technology, blah, blah, blah. Another note, you'll notice that at least a few of these producers were the actual artist, as mentioned, and while I made a stark distinction last week because that was a new thing in the 50s, and I saved that for the bonus MxTRA, at this point, the idea of producing music in the way we know it now was already so set. There's no need to separate out the artist producers from the producer producers. Final note, specific to this decade, the number of great producers and producers in general exploded compared to the 50s. There is no way I can profile all of them, so I'm going to flesh out a few of the big ones and then do an honorable mentions list, as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode. So the first one, let's get him out of the way. Phil Spector. Had some early success in the late 1950s, but really made his impact in the 60s, even though he did work beyond that. The Wall of Sound was hugely influential, and what that meant was creating kind of grandeur and a sense of space and largeness for an act that was small, just a few, instruments and a vocal or a few vocals, bringing an orchestral flair and quality to pop and rock music. He was an auteur, not the first, but one of the first to be well known. He was an egomaniac. He was abusive. He was a liar in many ways. Beyond that, I don't need to say more because his story has been told. I'm not going to tell it. But I'd like to also give Jack Nitzsche credit for doing a lot of the work that Spector couldn't or wouldn't. And Jack Nitzsche went on to work with the Stones and other acts as well. So give Jack Nitzsche credit where credit is due. And that's all I'm going to say about Phil Spector. But while we're on the subject of troubled geniuses, let me just make a correction here. And that is, I mentioned Joe Meek last week. I really should have saved him for this week because his real impact was more in the 1960s. Again, the experimentation, auteur, alone in a small studio thing, and setting that kind of standard. Really, he was one of the first. And it often takes outliers like him to do things no one else is doing to spark more of the mainstream people to go there, which is really what happened. Honestly, a lot of what the people attribute to the Beatles as innovations were them, being inspired by other people who did it and then taking it to the nth degree and making it popular, which is a very important thing to do as well. Next one, Berry Gordy. No denying that over the late 50s and early 60s, Motown developed a signature sound that resulted in wild success and influence, not to mention incredible music and artists, and that Berry Gordy was the man behind the curtain. But, in truth, much of the production was done by others, especially Smokey Robinson, Norman Whitfield, Sylvia Moy, and certainly so many others. So let's talk about them. Sylvia Moy, first of all, first woman I mentioned in this series. I hope to mention more. I'll mention one more in this week, but I hope to mention more as the weeks go on and the episodes go on for this series. Not surprising considering the times, but she was a performer and songwriter. She co-wrote Uptight for Steve. Hey, man, everything is all right. Uptight, out of sight, Stevie Wonder, and ended up writing and or producing many of Stevie's early hit singles, and some for Martha and the Vandellas, the Isley Brothers, and Marvin Gaye. Norman Whitfield, co-writer and producer for a ton of Motown hits. And by ton, I mean at least 90. Yeah. Including Ain't Too Proud to Beg, I Heard It Through the Grapevine, I Can't Get Next to You, War, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Say it again. Just My Imagination, Running Away with Me. Papa was a Rolling Stone. He did lots of work with the Temptations, extending through the 1970s. Side note, if you want to understand exactly what kind of work Norman Whitfield did and why he was so significant, just listen to the music that I mentioned. Go look it up. That's why I don't play it. I want you to go look it up. Take the time after this. I have listened to so many podcasts that it's a standard often to combine the music with the talking about the music. And I honestly, very seldom do I like that, because I'm there to get information, to get the facts, to get the stories and the knowledge and the narrative and all of that stuff. If I'm, inspired enough by what I'm hearing, then I'll go listen to the music. I've done it hundreds of times where I've paused the podcast to listen to something. I don't want it forced on me, and I don't force it on you. Smokey Robinson is the other one. After some research and thought, there is no doubt in my mind that if not for Smokey, Berry Gordy and Motown would not have had the success they did. He was the real man behind the curtain early on until Norman Whitfield came along. He wrote and produced hits for certainly him and the Miracles, but well beyond that, such as My Guy for Mary Wells, The Way You Do the Things You Do, and My Girl for the Temptations, and many more. He is someone who can do it all and do it all well. He's always been one of my faves, and I really probably should do an episode on his entire career, especially while he's still alive. Brian Wilson. What could I say about him that hasn't already been said? Beatles fans like me tend to credit the Beatles with raising the stakes and propelling the conversation forward regarding music production and complexity, and yeah, they did. But one of the main guys who inspired them to do it was Brian Wilson. His idea that a song could be pop and serious and orchestral and complex and emotionally affecting not only brought about Pet Sounds, which itself was inspired by Rubber Soul, but Pet Sounds inspired Revolver and Sgt. Pepper and all the chamber pop and art rock acts beyond this. It helped people realize you didn't need to confine yourself to what? A genre. Oh, this is rock or pop. It shouldn't have such and such parts. He gave depth and resonance to the wall of sound and heart. And though I've only come to fully appreciate his work in later years, his existence as one of the first artists to fully control his writing, arranging, performing, and producing his own material has certainly inspired me to do the same. I've done it for years, not to mention his intricate and still so effective vocal harmony arrangements, which they have inspired me. If you listen to Rex's song Final Call, you're going to hear a lot of Beach Boys on that, a lot of Brian Wilson. The Beatles bandmate of mine. I'm in the Beatles cover band, Prefab 4. Is a huge Beatles fan. Admits that the vocal arrangements for the Beach Boys were probably even more impressive than the majority of Beatles harmonies, which is saying something. Speaking of which, we get to the big gun. Now, they're all big guns, but come on, 1960s, George Martin. So we do a show, our Beatles band does also a scripted show called Yeah, Yeah, Yeah. And one of the lines in that script says that George Martin started out as a producer of comedy albums and working with classical music, comedy albums of Peter Sellers, etc. It's made to seem like, what? How does that connect? Like it's incongruous with what came after. But that kind of environment, recording comedy albums where you're encouraged to experiment and get weird for comedic effect with sound effects, looping tape, backward tape, splice, all of that, vary speed, which at the time meant, let's say you wanted somebody to sound high-pitched singing, like a chipmunk. That's vary speed, like one of the chipmunks, Alvin and Simon Theodore, whatever. You slowed down the backing tracks, recorded normally, brought it back up to normal, and it made the voice sound high. Lots and lots and lots of multitracking. All that stuff was experimental at the time, and a comedy environment allowed you to do that. That directly fed into George Martin's ability to toss in left field ideas and techniques with the Beatles. And if you meld that with his early music work with classical music, stewarding classical music at Parlophone and all of that, and he had such vast knowledge of it, and his work with skiffle and Liverpool acts, which the Beatles were, it made him, in hindsight, the perfect match for the Beatles, and it kind of explains why that synergy happened there and why he really is, to me, you can make a list of all the fifth Beatles in existence. He's really the fifth Beatle. And the Beatles not only eventually wanted classical music, elements in their work, but they revered comedy and brought a lot of that into their work as well. So you can see perfect match. So Martin is often said to be the most famous producer in the world, which, because if the Beatles are still to some degree the most famous and most successful music artists in the world, it makes sense that George Martin would be the most famous. Most people, you may love Queen. I don't know who produced Queen. I'm going to find out, I guess, when I do, the next episode in this series. But you almost always know Beatles, George Martin. That's very rare. Beach Boys would be maybe one of the only other exceptions, or Prince, or the auteur types. And this is not an auteur situation. He was calm and attentive, but also authoritative and exacting. Good mix. He helped shape the Beatles' works every step of the way, honoring their sound and energy and intentions, but elevating it to excellence and adding in things the way a good producer does that says, well, what if you tried this? And made it that much better. Those are the big guns of the decade. Let's talk about some honorable mentions, of which there are quite a few. Jimmy Miller is a New York City rock dude whose best work straddled the 60s and 70s. His style's been described as wild magic and slightly chaotic. He produced all of Steve Winwood's early work and a bunch of albums from the Stones from the late 60s and early 70s, and continued producing until his death in 1994. We have Jimmy Miller to thank for more cowbell, because he added the cowbell to Honky Tonk Women. Shel Talmy was a British producer noted for his work with the Kinks and the Who and lots of other mod acts, among others. One of those kind of get-out-of-the-way producers who let the artists do their thing and then just made it better. And again, bonus MxTRA, patreon.com/music is not a genre, is me talking about an archetype like the get-out-of-the-way producer and the 5 producer archetypes in general. So check that out. Jerry Wexler. He's more of an exec than a producer, but deserves mentioning because he nurtured a ton of great artists and sounds, including the Muscle Shoals sound. And he's the one who coined the term rhythm and blues when he was a journalist, before he got into the music business. Lou Adler doesn't pop up on a lot of lists as a producer, but he very, very, very much shaped the 1960s folk pop sounds with acts like Mamas and the Papas and Cass Elliot, Barry McGuire, Johnny Rivers, and went on to produce the best of Carole King's work. Shadow Morton. Somebody nicknamed him, his name's George. He was nicknamed Shadow because he was hard to pin down. Some people couldn't find him. I guess he was late often, whatever. He was a key architect in the girl group sound, leader of the pack. And a new favorite of mine, Sophisticated Boom Boom, which I might do a cover of. Also worked with Janice and Vanilla Fudge, Iron Butterfly, and he continued to produce through the early 1970s. And then alcoholism caught up with him. He did recover eventually, I believe. Terry Melcher helped shape the California sound and folk rock, the Byrds, Paul Revere and the Raiders, some easy listening people like Wayne Newton and Pat Boone, also acts like Glenn Campbell, Ry Cooder, Mamas and the Papas. He produced through the 1970s and also released his own music and then produced sporadically through the 1990s. Terry Melcher was the only son of Doris Day. Teo Macero is a jazz composer and arranger who eventually turned producer. He's one of those transitional people I mentioned last week who was working long before there was such thing as a producer, or at least maybe, yeah, in some ways. He started producing in the 1950s. He composed and produced a lot of third stream jazz in New York City. Third stream is when jazz and when classical is interpreted as jazz, like Jacques Lussier. I did an entire episode on third stream jazz, or classical elements are incorporated into jazz. Produced a lot of classic jazz artists like Charles Mingus, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, Thelonious Monk, Dave Brubeck, Count Basie, Tony Bennett, Maynard Ferguson, Stan Getz, and even Johnny Mathis. Eventually composed and or produced a bunch of soundtracks. He was great at corralling artists and their materials in a way that made cohesion out of confusion or cacophony. The music itself might have been great, but to put it all together in an album, which we'll talk more about albums probably in the next episode of this series, because that's when they become super significant, and make that a listening experience that worked. It's not always easy to do with jazz artists, especially the more experimental ones. He was able to do it. Bones Howe, Sunshine pop producer and engineer. He worked with acts like the Turtles, The Association, Fifth Dimension. He also worked with Tom Waits for a decade, I believe, and was a music supervisor on several films. Ethel Gabriel, the other woman I mentioned so far in this series, and that will change, but more gradually than we would like, but it will change. She popularized the easy listening orchestral stuff, particularly the Living Strings series. Look it up. Living also, that was so successful that there were spinoffs like Living Jazz, Living Voices, Living Guitars, Living Brass. She was originally relegated to the dying Camden, New Jersey division of RCA Records because the guy was like, the woman shouldn't even be in a position like this. Let's just throw her somewhere where nothing's going to happen. She ended up revitalizing it and making it one of the most successful divisions in the company. Bob Johnston, New York City, and then eventually Nashville producer who produced classics by Dylan, Simon and Garfunkel, Johnny Cash, Leonard Cohen. He was mostly a get-out-of-the-way guy who would add sweeteners like strings and things, just enough and no more. And again, that's an archetype. I'll talk about producer archetypes, the bonus MxTRA, patreon.com/music is not a genre. David Hassinger, LA engineer for the Stones and others who graduated producer for acts like Electric Prunes and the Grateful Dead. Apparently a master engineer who could make even a bad studio sound good, and worked with a couple dozen other big name artists from a bunch of genres, especially in the San Francisco scene and psychedelic rock and folk rock. Tom Dowd, one of those, I say unsung heroes only because I never heard of him, but he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2012, if that means anything to anybody. I had a discussion on Quora today about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Somebody asked, why do people not like it? And the dude who answered listed all of these so-called non-rock acts like Cyndi Lauper and a bunch of rappers and things like that. And I said, maybe that's true, but that's a very rockist point of view, and a lot of people don't like the Rock and Roll Hall because it had for years discriminated against acts that weren't considered quote-unquote rock. But anyway, Tom Dowd was an engineer in the 1940s, turned producer after that, and worked until his death in 2002. He's credited with popularizing the 8-track recording system and other features like linear faders. So when you look at a mixing board, you see the faders, they go up and down. Used to be knobs. And he just was like, faders are easier. And he popularized that. Post-recording effects, which I talked about, fix it in the mix kind of things. You want to add reverb after You can do that. He worked with a range of artists in soul, such as Ray Charles and Ruth Brown, R&B and doo-wop, such as the Drifters, Coasters, and Spinners, rock, such as Lynyrd Skynyrd and the Eagles, pop, such as Bobby Darin and the Bee Gees, and jazz, such as John Coltrane, Thelonious Monk, and Charlie Parker. And finally, major props to session musicians who, though they were not producers, they, in quote-unquote inadvertently, but much more advertently, shaped the sound of so many artists. It comes to mind, and there was, I believe, a documentary on them, The Wrecking Crew. Look them up. Musicians who played on everything from the Beach Boys to, the Monkees, etc., and so many major hits, the 1960s in particular and beyond. The Motown musicians, and the Funk Brothers, who played on almost everything during that period. The musicians for Stax, who made that sound, and the musicians at the Muscle Shoals, area, who made that sound. Big, big props to all of them. That's it for producers for the 1960s. How about some conclusions? So to sum up, the breaking of musical boundaries and the advancement of recording technology brought about an explosion of creative production work that affected all kinds of music and set out the templates for all work that has come since. One of the main developments that stemmed from this was the idea that performers themselves didn't need to be great or come in with a distinct sound even. Those things could be created or enhanced or determined in the studio by the producer and to whatever degree by the artist. The producer rapidly became as important a part of the creation process as the artists themselves. At the same time, the suite of tools in a recording studio were so much easier to acquire and manipulate, and cheaper, let's not forget that the auteur artist producer type popped up more and more and more. They started a little in the 50s, but really blossomed in the 60s and beyond. And again, that's one of those archetypes that I will talk about in the bonus MxTRA at patreon.com/music is not a genre, the 5 producer archetypes. You're going to love that one. Along these lines, it's important to note that roles in music, as in other arts, are often fluid and vague. So while some sources list people as significant producers, I felt they were more either executive producer or engineer. And I didn't mention them, or I put them in honorable mention, Still significant work in every way, but not quite what you think of as a producer. Point being that collaborative works are made from multiple contributors whose sources and roles are not always clearly defined. No doubt that no decade has more great music than any other. I don't care what anybody says, but the 1960s in relation to everything after looms much larger than any decade before and most decades since. It's where so much of what we now take as a given started. The 1960s were also, though, a transitional decade in that the focus on singles only gradually shifted to albums. So even though we often think of, Sgt. Pepper, blah, blah, that was a revelation, Pet Sounds and stuff like that, to the point where even through the late 60s, even into the 70s, the single was still dominant. The album was only dominant for a couple of decades after that, and then again faded into the background, and singles became dominant again, and they still are. That really, albums didn't emerge as the main thing till the mid-late 1960s. And I say this because we're at that fun part of each of these episodes where I do my favorites of the decade. So, favorite producers. George Martin. Absolutely. Why would I say anybody else? Smokey Robinson, though, to me is the second. 100% is the second. Brian Wilson is a close third, though. But if Teo Macero did indeed greatly shape the albums of those jazz artists I mentioned, then he's here too, because Brubeck and Monk especially are just two of my favorites. And if he worked with them, then he's got to be a favorite producer of the decade. Favorite albums of the decade? Are you kidding? How do you pick that? But I'm going to go with Revolver since Beatles are my favorite group, and that's right now what I'm ranking is the best Beatles album. Besides that, I'd very likely choose other British invasion bands like The Who or The Kinks. It was hard, again, because the album was not a thing as much as we think it is. Days of Future Past, maybe? Moody Blues? I don't know. Artists. Beatles. Yes, Smokey. And The Who and The Kinks. Honestly, the Supremes, I used to be like, Supremes. And then the more I heard, I'm like, oh my God, they had so many hits and so many great songs. Some of the Beach Boys, quite a bit of the Beach Boys, more than I would normally admit. But I'm starting to realize that as a kid and even to today, So many amazing Beach Boys songs. And speaking of songs, again, how do you pick favorites? But there's no reason for me to stray from my favorite artists. So name almost any Beatles song. I'm going to say that, is a favorite. Almost. For a while, my favorite was Drive My Car because of the clever, cheeky lyrics. I don't know what my favorite Beatles song is right now. You call one out. Most smoky songs, most songs by The Who, similar for the Kinks. God Only Knows by Beach Boys ranks. So some of the favorite songs of the 1960s. Speaking of great songs, the featured song. So again, in keeping with the developmental nature of this series, I'm choosing a song that marks a step in my own development as a producer. It's called Sample, and it's when I was under the artist name Nick, all caps. And it's from an EP that I never released called Black Eyed Susan. It is now on SoundCloud, and there is a link to this song in the text. But as with last week's song, which was That Is All I Need, I plan to redo this song in a stripped-down version for a new project under my old artist name called Valley of the Unreleased, because there were dozens of songs that I never recorded or recorded poorly, or not poorly, but poorly by today's standards, and want to make sure they get out into the world, and this song Sample is one of them. But I request that you bear with me again, because while this is 10 years later, this song, than last week's pick, it's still a home recording. It was done on a Tascam 4-track. So yes, you're going to hear improvements in my performance commensurate with 10 years of development and songwriting and production, but you're also going to hear the fact that it was recorded on that Tascam with an Alesis HR16 drum machine, with an Ensoniq ESQ1 keyboard, and an FX box. I don't remember the name of the FX box. I think this was the perfect pick for this episode because it harkens back to the beginning of multi-track recording, the way I described how I use a 4-track, bouncing and all of that. And also because this song Sample, it has a vaguely 1960s sound, even though it was recorded in the mid-90s when some of that was coming back, honestly. It's funky, it's mod, it's crunchy. I can't really say what all the lyrics are about other than possibly they're about a person's obsession with his partner, as if the partner is a drug. There's some light reference to ritualistic S&M and how sex can be used as a means of escaping reality. So you're welcome, America. Sample. Not released, this version, and never will be. But the link to SoundCloud is there. And again, I'm going to release a stripped-down version next year. Either way, you can hear this version by clicking the link or just stick around in about a minute. Questions: are you in to 1960s music at all? If so, what are some of your favorites from this decade? Were you aware of the huge leap in production values and options from the 1950s? If so, do you have any favorite producers or production qualities or styles? I'd like to know the answer to all of these and more, because as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thanks for hanging with me for part 2 of The Great Producers, and I'll talk to you next week.
Y'all be your friends up lonely when I'm up and down, and this is what I do. My ears are tuning to the changes in your system. Twice a day I hum with you. In the morning when the sheets are ready and the leather is sanitized, in the evening after the ceremony when all heaven is on your side. Call me a joker, call me a friend of a friend, a sucker, right and wrong time, this is what I do. My eyes are focused on the changes in the system. Twice a day